Okay, welcome, everybody. This is the final episode of this series that we are doing on Hegel, and it's the final episode in the series where we attempt to try and answer the sort of question, is being knowable? We've gone through many variations of the question and we've watched it really develop and take shape in both its ontological and its epistemological forms, in its forms of the nature of being and knowing. And in this episode, we want to sort of close off and propose a sort of answer to the question, um, a sort of an affirmative being knowable. And I think it's worthwhile to say that before we get stuck into the material, there is something about the very material itself that is going to make our attempt to assert anything about it undermine itself. Unfortunately, what Daniel and I have been noticing over the past few weeks is that the dialectical nature of this material requires one to sort of go through it and do the activity that is reading the phenomenology of spirit to come to the conclusions that we are coming to in reading this text. And so by discussing it, we can only do so much. We can provide a stepping stone and we can provide a way into the text, but we can't do the performative action that is the actual reading of the text. Now, why this is relevant and why I think we're about to undermine ourselves is because for the past few weeks, we've been positing or assuming, which is a terrible thing to do in reading Hegel because he tries to be assumptionless, that the point of major contact between the object and the subject, or knowing and being, will occur in self consciousness. That is after consciousness. And the reason for that is because self consciousness is an object unto itself. That is, consciousness is both the knowing subject and the object known. What consciousness knows when it is conscious of itself or aware of itself is itself. And so, this polarity where consciousness takes upon a side and views itself from a distance allows self consciousness a sort of unity that does not occur in any of the previous chapters of consciousness that we've been through over the past few weeks. Over the past few weeks, we've actually seen how basic shapes of consciousness in Hegel tend to break themselves down. We watched that happen in sense certainty at the beginning with the now, and how the object that was for sense certainty supposed to be an individual immediate being, a this, turned out upon further reflection to be a universal object that was mediated. This, in the sense of a universal or the generic thing that all this is share together. We watch that further developed into this particular thing in sense certainty, where through examining Hegel's argument, most particularly about this salt, we came to see that thinghood and mediated universality consisted in three phases, the first of which was being an also, a sort of shared space upon which many properties conglomerate. The tartness and the whiteness sit upon the same plane in the same place in this salt. But in being this salt, the salt finds a way to enclose itself, it self encloses, and becomes a unity or a one. In so doing, it has the ability to distinguish itself from other things and also contain properties insofar as they are not distinguished from one another. That is, the properties in salt, tartness and whiteness, even though opposed insofar as tartness is not white and whiteness is not tart, come to somehow be, through the power of salt, to exclude tartness insofar as it is not white and whiteness insofar as it is not tart. But precisely in doing so, in preserving itself as a one, it turns out that salt is much like everything else, sugar and other things. Because in turning itself into a one, it turns out that all other things also have this property of unity, this oneness to them. The sugar is the sugar, and that salt is the salt. And so by being one, they turn out to be like each other. There is a universality to it. And so the final stage is to posit the salt as a sort of exclusive one, a one that excludes others. Finally, in doing so, we come to the point where we've arrived at, which is enforcing the understanding, and we watch the sort of exclusivizing nature, the sort of dynamicity of being self enclosing upon itself. And we notice that the shared universality that it has with all other things in its oneness uh, makes it much like them. By being in itself, it turns out to be like others. And for now, before we get stuck into the material, that's where I want to leave it. We have come to the stage in the development of being through the question of being knowable, where being in itself and being for another would like to coincide. But, as Hegel says, the understanding tries to keep them apart. And so, because Daniel's been struggling with it a little bit, I would like him to maybe speak about the difficulty of watching being for another and being for self turn out to be the same thing in a sense, and to talk more about that difficulty because that difficulty, that staying away from, that holding on to, is precisely what Hegel is pointing to as a natural activity of the understanding. Dividing and keeping things apart insofar as we can keep them apart. But by doing that and using the insofar as a label, we are sort of holding things apart that we already know are together. So I shall open the floor and let Daniel speak.
Fantastic. Yeah, cool. Okay. So the you're bringing in the Kantian frame and acknowledging that Hegel is in a Kantian universe, or that he is speaking to Kant. And we entertaining the possibility that he goes further or develops that universe. Brings in that idea of this thing in itself and for itself. So something that is in itself and for itself, this unreachable thing on the Kantian program, this object that is self-contained, in itself, for itself. There's a performative contradiction in Kant in that he conceives that thought. He thought that thought. He thought the thing in itself. So the thing in itself is also for another. Now there's like nuance to the directionality of that. The thing in itself is a thing in itself, is being in itself for another. Now there's different. I'm going to try not to just use the same words, but there's difference in emphasis of direction. So the one who conceives, who has the thought of a thing in itself, which we saying in this just simplified version is where Kant stops. Kant then, if he stops, involves himself in a performative contradiction because that thing that is in itself and for itself is in itself and for itself for another, the other being him, the one who conceived it. So it introduces the other into the question, or the conceiving one, or the so maybe the question would be the what is the what kind of a thing is the for another of the thing that is in and for itself. But that might just to be a direction.
Okay, so a couple things I think worth talking about. So the contradiction of the thing in itself, just so that we can clarify, Kant, I think, is well aware of the contradiction of the thing itself. And I think it's maybe one of my favorite contradictions in philosophy. I think I explained this to you guys the other night when we were talking about it before it was recorded. But the thing in itself for Kant is unthinkable. And in being so, it's contradictory. We can't think a contradiction. So we can't think the thing in itself. And so the thing in itself, by sort of being contradictory, which is a predicate that we can't even predicate of it because it's beyond our consciousness, is kind of the only way to characterize it. Like it's almost it's beyond thoughtness, enables, of course it's contradictory, you know? Like
Yeah.
what are we supposed to say about it? I think the way that you put it made it sound as though Kant thinks the thing in itself, and so he grasps the reality of what the thing in itself is.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that's one way to characterize it. And I think that's the way that most people complain about Kant, you know? He introduces this thing in itself into a system, and then he says the whole time, he just keeps going, we can't talk about it, we can't talk about it, we can't talk about it. But he talks about it. Like, he tries to say stuff about it. Inevitably, the stuff that he tries to say does fail because of the nature of the thing that he's talking about. But I don't think that's necessarily Hegel's gripe with it. I do think that you get the dialectic almost correct, but the gripe is not that Kant thinks the thing in itself and then he is there for the thing in itself to be thought. I think that's one very interesting way to think about it, though. And I think it's a way that a lot of people take Hegel to be complaining about Kant. I think Hegel, I'm not sure why this is more interesting to me. Hegel sees that that denial in the thing in itself, of talking about it or of not talking about it, saying we can't talk about it, and really making it a thing in itself, is correct to some extent, but incorrect or incomplete somehow. It's sort of lacking. And the way in which it's lacking is the way that you sort of characterize the second half of it, that it is for Kant. Um, it is even in its not being. And so, to put that in less obscure terms, if the thing in itself is for itself, then it's not for an other. But Kant is, to some extent. Like, he's the one doing the writing and the thinking and so on and so forth. And all of us, insofar as we think, not the particular physical body that we occupy, not the particular mind that we occupy, not the particular thoughts that we think, just us thinking insofar as we think, insofar as we're thinking about this thing in itself and what it is not, kind of are. And that's kind of the Cartesian trick, is to see that, we can deny all of these things, but we can't deny that we think, because the denial is itself a thought, and so presupposes the very activity which it attempts to deny. The actions sort of betray the words. Something like, I'm not speaking, or speaking is impossible, as an assertion, is self contradictory because I'm speaking when I say it, and so it must be possible. And so that's the second part of it. The second part of it is to notice that each thinker, insofar as they think, is something. Not a thing in itself, or maybe not a thing in itself. We can't even say what they are yet. We just know that they are. In a sense, weirdly enough, they're much like being. We can't really say what they are. As soon as we say that it's Daniel and he's this kind of a guy, or it's Hadley and he's sitting behind this laptop, then that's a whole bunch of groundless assertions. All we can say is that there is thinking going on and that this thinking exists, and that it's not the thing in itself, because the thing in itself is beyond thought. But if it's not the thing in itself, then it's an other to the thing in itself. And so, even though the thing in itself is only for itself, it only exists for its own sake, it's only out of its own sort of determination that it exists, there's something else.
Yeah.
That thing thinking the thing in itself. But counterintuitively, and this I think is really the Hegelian turn, in there being something else, there is an other to the thing in itself, something that is not the thing in itself, the thinking thing, whatever you want to call it. But insofar as there is an other to the thing in itself, the thing in itself is an other to the other that is for it. It's not the thinking thing. And so by being other to the other, it itself is an other. It takes on this characteristic of being the other of me, the thinking thing, whatever you want to call that term that we can't really put a label on as yet.
Mm.
And by being an other, it is for another.
Yeah.
Being in this non-relational relationship, it sort of comes to be for another. And so we get this weird sort of self-reflectedness where the thing in itself turns out to be other to the other, and so turns out to be for another. And this is, as I was saying to Daniel before we started, I think a picture which is distinctly Hegelian. And I think the reason for it being distinctly Hegelian is because it relies on us realizing that if we suppose, as I think Kant did, that things in themselves and appearances, or the thing in itself and anything that's not the thing in itself, are different kinds of things, different categories, then there's no way that the thing in itself can be an other. Those two properties, being a thing in itself and being an other, are mutually exclusive on that picture. So once we've done the Hegelian argument, we end up at a contradiction. The thing in itself is for another. Being an other means being for another. The thing in itself is for itself and for another. This, I think, is a picture that can't exist in Kant's world. And the importance of that means not that Hegel's just putting forth a contradictory argument, because I think that might be one way of reading the text. From when I was writing about Kant, I learned that a lot of people like to assert that philosophers are doing contradictory stuff, or this argument must be a bad argument because it's contradictory. But if we think about it in the context that Hegel's writing in and what he's trying to do, the contradiction forces us to sort of reconceptualize. It's now that we know that the thing in itself is for itself and for another, either being in itself and being for other aren't different kinds of things, or the thing in itself can't exist. But the second motion, again, the thing in itself must exist, because that's what it is to be a thing in itself. It's to exist.
Uh,
And
d-
so,
uh, yeah. I don't want to disrupt the flow, but I want to push into that the contradiction, I think, just to bring it out a bit more. Like the um I'm thinking about it in terms of like a direction, and you're bringing in the language of kinds.
mm,
So the being for itself, being for uh the thing in itself, the way in which it's being for another. So the way that the other constitutes the thing in itself, there might be like there might be. That's what I'm thinking into, the directionality of that. And I think that gets into the kinds. So the thing in itself, as being in itself for another, the other then might not be a thing in itself, and so constitutes the thing in itself in its otherness. But that doesn't put that doesn't so the second move that you made, it doesn't put us into that second move. So maybe you'll help me there in terms of the way that you establish the otherness of the thing in itself.
Sure. I want to try and give an analogy, but it may not be the best analogy because I haven't thought about it too much. But this is kind of how I'm trying to think about it. So think about the planets, right? We've got Earth over here, and then we've got Mars, and then we've got, I don't know, Pluto, and then we've got the sun, right? Now, if the sun is a thing in itself, it exists over there sort of by itself, and it has nothing to do with anything else. If all the planets die from heat death, I don't know if that's how that works in science, but if they do and the sun keeps going, then the sun is by itself and for itself. Now, there is an Earth, right? And in this sense, the Earth would be something like the subject or something like that, because it would be other to the thing in itself. It's not necessarily like attached to the sun or directly in contact with the sun, and it's not even the same type of thing that the sun is. It's other to the sun. But in being other to the sun, it becomes sort of not the sun. So then we've got the sun by itself, and we've got not the sun, which is the earth. And that's the sort of second motion. And then to look upon the earth and to realize, the earth's not the sun, and it doesn't really exist by itself, but in not existing for itself, it sort of self-relates itself to the sun, or the sun is now other to it. And so the relationship that I'm trying to point out to is the sun, by not being the earth, comes into a relationship with the earth. And then the earth, by not being the sun, sort of circles back in on itself and makes the sun realize what it truly is, the center of the solar system. That thing, which by being the type of thing that it is, gives rise to the earth and also nourishes it and whatnot, and is in relationship with the earth, not as the same kind of thing, but as a sort of byproduct or like sort of secondary output of the thing. The sun doesn't directly produce the earth, but there
Mm,
would be no earth without the sun, and there could be no solar system without them both being in constant sort of interplay with one another.
mm,
So too with the thing in itself and the other that is not the thing in itself. The thing in itself is supposed to be this existent being, existing in no place and no time, weirdly in Kant, but it just is. And that's what it is. It just has to be. And we know that it has to be, or we can get to it because when we try to take away everything that we experience, the appearances, we take away the shape, we take away their size, their time, and where they are in time and location and stuff like that, which is kind of a cool thought experiment. Like Kant thinks that you can literally like pick a moment in your life and then like erase all the content. And by doing that, you'll sort of see the sort of um, emptiness of the things that appear to you. But you can't erase that existence, whatever the existence is, or you can't erase the erasing, you know? And so there must be at least something, the thing that thinks, and then the sort of thing that it thinks. And that sort of thing that it thinks can't be reduced to these conceptual relations or spaces and times because all of those things are instrumental. And so the content wouldn't ever enter my mind, so to speak, if there weren't
mm,
this thing itself. But by this reduction of appearances, by coming to see that there must be something that is not appearance that we can't speak about, Hegel notices we can. not speak about it. Like the moment we notice it, it's sort of like it's there for us, and now we've opened this level playing field. And
We can speak its unspeakability, like we can think its unthinkability. Yeah.
precisely, I think. And I think he wants to really push through on that. I'm not sure necessarily if this is an orthodox reading or whether this is the common view, but
Yeah.
that is what I am getting from the text. And even though that unity of being for self and being for another in different modes, not kinds, comes to exist in the end of at the end of perception, where the sort of uh, object of perception sort of breaks itself down, and the last insofar that separates being for another and being for self fall asunder. We sort of get a similar move in Force in the Understanding, which I don't really understand. But Force in the Understanding focuses on the sort of concept of a thing and then its expression and then the being that is its expression or whatever. You sort of have those like three phases of force, whatever that is. And what happens is we go through sort of three worlds in Force in the Understanding. I want to say he doesn't label them as such, but it's sort of the ordinary world. And the ordinary world is the world where appearance is taken for reality. It's what we do in everyday life. Things appear to us, and we sort of take the truth of them for granted. The fire appears hot, and so we believe that it is. But it could just be a heater behind a light show. Um, I don't know. The 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 plane appears as a bird, but is actually a plane. Things like that. All of those sorts of things that people sort of throw out as we can be mistaken about the true nature of the object. Um, but in everyday life, we take it for granted. We assume things about it. We use the fire that looks hot to cook our food, and we don't really go, is this fire actually hot, or is it just like a light show and a bunch of electronics behind this by like some weird deceiver? We just take the truth of it for granted, and then we carry on with our being. It's only sort of like upon reflection or philosophical reflection that that sort of like questioning begins to come to light. Um, and then that's the second sort of world, the inverted world, which is what he uses in Force in the Understanding um, around the middle of the chapter. I can't remember necessarily where the inverted world comes in, but the inverted world is a world where sort of what is what appears to be white is actually black. What appears to be sweet is actually sour. So, like in the
Mm.
inverted world, we posit that appearance is not reality.
Yeah.
So, basically, that light show that is fire and is warm, we
Yeah.
are actually saying that it's not fire because what appears to us isn't real anymore. Like we've lost the whole world to illusion. And so
Okay.
the
Okay.
world
Okay. Okay. Okay.
becomes an illusion to us. At least that's how I've been understanding it. The salt tastes salty, but in fact, it's not salty because it just appears salty. And I can never get beyond that appearance because I can't escape my own body and mind and all of these preconceptions to sort of get to the thing in itself. Uh, and so I posit it as a beyond, as a in the true world, which is the inverted world, the thing is actually sweet. Salt is sweet, all of that sort of stuff. And so he gives us an ethical example, which I think works really well, where he talks about, I mean, he can't use this to illustrate his work at the moment because it's a theoretical part of the text, but he talks about punishment. And punishment appears painful, right? Like we punish people and it sucks. Like they are going through hell. We put people in prisons and there's corporal punishment. There's all sorts of like physical abuse and mental abuse, and we keep these people there. And we say it's good for them. So the appearance that appears to us is not the truth of the thing in itself. In the true world, the inverted world, punishment is a reparation of the soul. It's rehabilitation. And so what appears to be bad turns out to be good in itself. And so in this inverted world, we get this weird, the appearance is not reality. Reality is a thing in itself. And yeah, that seems kind of like what's going on, in certain philosophers' works. And it seems to be one of the ways that, people project this world, the content of this world, and the opposite of the content of this world into this idealized world. Everything is for a purpose. People are punished, and then that leads to better goods in heaven. And so, like, when we think about it like that, like, we project this whole universe above itself, above this world where everything appears to be painful, where everything appears to be bad, and things aren't what they appear to be,
Mm.
where the fire that's hot is cold, and all of this sort of stuff is the opposite of what it appears to be. And so what we get in the world is just appearances. They're illusions. They falsify what the thing is in itself. But, and here is the big but, the inverted world, the world that is in itself true, where punishment is good, and there is this promise of these things being true, is itself only in opposition or abstracted from the world that we started with, the world of appearance. It's not actually a different content. We just take the content of appearance and negate it, and then we fill it up with a negation. And Hegel says that,
Yeah,
like,
we positivize, we project the negative,
yeah,
where the negative constitutes the thing. It's
yeah.
like the opposite, yeah.
And Hegel says that this projection's even worse than just letting the thing be what it is, because what it should be is empty void. We're
Okay,
scared of the
okay.
nullity,
We sorry, I'm anxious. I'm anxious.
as we
There's
should
a,
be.
there's we are in riches. We are it's so let me just try and gather myself and gather the material. I love the analogy of the solar system. What you were just speaking to now, the Holy of Holies, the void behind the curtain, and where we get to at the end of Force and Understanding is the curtain opening. And that's that pushing through that I think you used that language, that pushing through of Hegel towards self-consciousness. So that's the moment that we've been after, whatever's happening in there. To get there, there's some kind of resolution in understanding and force. That's the kind of area where you're playing around. So just still gathering stuff. The analog of the solar system and the Earth, and the way those two are related. So we're saying that's an analog in terms of the sun being the in itself or the thing in itself, and then the earth as the other. Another kind of filling out of terms might be the sun as the object, then the earth as the subject. Then, okay, then we have the religious imagery too of the Holy of Holies, at the end of which the veil gets ripped, the curtain opened. We have appearance, the what you were really getting into there was the consequence of appearance, in that we posit a beyond, and that beyond is populated by the opposite or the negative of the thing that is appearing. But what is persistently difficult in Hegel's thought is the way that what something is what something is not is part of what something is. So the negative constitutes the thing. It's a determinate negation. I heard this week that that comes from Plato, actually, the line determinate
Already.
negation. I'm trying to remember where I heard it, but but there's a determinateness to the negation. So the opposite of what's like the tart and the sweet. Tart, I've never like used that word so much. So so okay. So then where we pushing into is we wanting to okay, just the last introductions of languages, which is all in tune with the languages that we've been using, and hopefully not too much. But this it's just the syllogism that we get in force and understanding. So there's the um the inner world, the appearance, and the what are the terms? It's the okay, so the thing in itself, which is like its inner essence or the inner being of the thing. Then there is the appearance, and then there's understanding. So the the syllogism is the inner being of the thing appears, it appears to understanding. So there's the connecting term, the middle term is appearance, which is what you're pouring into now. Then inner being is understanding or is understood. Thing in itself, uh, conceiver of thing in itself, and appearance between. So I'm not landing at a question, but the the uh, material. We pushing at or pushing, yeah, the move from how do we get past the wrong conceptualization or the wrong positing of the beyond behind appearance is a framing of the direction I think that we're going.
So let's return to your curtain analogy that ends up at the end with force and understanding, because I think that understanding the analogy will actually help us get there. So let me just get to the passage. It's somewhere in 163, I think, or 164.
The last passage also 165.
Ah, raised above perception, consciousness exhibits itself in a closed unity with the supersensible world through the mediating term of appearance, through which it gazes into this background lying behind appearance. The two extremes of the syllogism, the one of the pure inner world, the other that of the inner being gazing into this pure inner world, have now coincided, and just as they, as extremes, have vanished, so too the middle term, as something other than these extremes, has also vanished. This curtain of appearance hanging before the inner world is therefore drawn away, and we have the inner being, the eye gazing into the inner world, the vision of the undifferentiated self-same being which repels itself from itself, posits itself as an inner being containing different moments, but for which equally these moments are immediately not different, self-consciousness. That's where we're heading. That is the
Yeah.
heading. And so to return to the analogy, the curtain, what is the curtain here? The curtain is appearance. The world as it appears to us is this curtain. Hegel is giving us this lustrous analogy that we should really. The grass outside, when we go on a walk and we look at the mountains, is like a curtain. We want to peek behind and see what the things are like in themselves. We want to see what's behind the curtain. And so where I was going in the beginning with the inverted world, the ordinary world, before we realize that there's even a curtain, looks solid. But we come up to the stage and we feel around, and this thing that seemed like a solid wall in front of us, this blackness in front of us, turns out to be mobile, turns out to have this motion to it. It's a curtain that appears as reality. And then once we recognize that it's a curtain, in the moment before we get the courage to pull the curtain back and draw and see what's beyond it, we sort of get the inverted world. We go, ah, there's a curtain. There must be something behind it, right? And since there's a curtain, everything that was on the curtain should be the opposite of what was on the curtain. What's behind the curtain shouldn't be like the curtain because that would make no sense. The curtain divides what is illusory from what is real. And so what's behind the curtain should be the opposite of the curtain. So where on the stage the actors appeared happy to us and as these developed beings behind the curtain in the green room where they're smoking their cigarettes, they're sad. And all the sort of excitedness that comes from sort of, the play of a stage sort of is put on. It's a falsity. Behind the actors on the stage are normal human beings in the green room having the same boring conversations as us. They are not these what we idolize them to be when they're on stage or something like that. We populate the world behind the curtain with what is not in this world, what's not behind the curtain. And so that's the inverted world, where the Holy of Holies becomes a place where punishment is good and reformatory and all of these sorts of things. But, and this I think is the Hegelian move, we pull the curtain back. There's nothing there. All
Yeah,
along.
yeah. So that that force, that positing of something behind is
Mhm.
when we start now in the direction towards understanding. So then there's the opening of the curtain and the revelation of void, of emptiness, which is so deplorable and even empty of itself. Something that so the the but then and now it's just in a space of like imagery for me. That doesn't yet seem to be the inner pure being or the inner being and the inner being of the thing. That seems to be like a dropping down.
I
So
think,
appearance is mediating the the okay, just like consistent with the subject and the object. The
I think
subject, yeah.
I want to interrupt. I think it's important to keep these three moments in mind: appearance as reality, the ordinary world as real, appearance as illusion, the sort of Cartesian philosophical world where what appears to us is not real, appearance as not reality. The third moment, the Hegelian moment, is actually quite Kantian: appearance as appearance. It's not
Mm,
false, it's just appearance. It is as it appears to be.
mm,
The fire looks hot, the electrical show is not hot. The fire looks hot and is hot. Behind the curtain, there's nothing to be seen. And there's nothing to be seen because the looker and the thing being looked at in this pure looking turn out to be, it's sort of like, I want to say, but he doesn't include the image here. Behind the curtain, we pull up a mirror or something. Like we look into the void and recognize ourselves in this sort of emptiness.
that's where
Understanding,
understanding is coming. Yeah.
yeah, and we can see that through how the understanding conceives of forces. Um, we haven't talked much about forces, but sort of what it does is it conceptualizes an appearance. It sort of creates this category of it and, gives it these determinate qualities. And then it sort of seeks out a predicate for it. Like it seeks out to, so like we see fire, right? And like when we see fire, we naturally just want to be like, what is fire? We want to say that fire is hot. But as soon as we say that fire is hot, even though that's true, we haven't really said anything. Heat is an essential quality of fire. And so in saying it, we've just basically said fire is fire. We've said A is A. And in doing so, the understanding makes a distinction which turns out to be no distinction at all.
Mm.
It's a sort of identity claim that sort of looks
Mm.
non-identical to the identity posited, but is not. And so concepts, I think I read this in, I think this is a guy called Gregory Moss, he used to go to UGA as well. Um, and he wrote his thesis on Hegel's concept. So I think I'm drawing on this because I briefly read a bit of that thesis this week. And he had this idea of the concept in Hegel being what it is to be a concept in Hegel is to be self differentiation. So, what a concept does is self differentiate. It sort of splits itself into parts and then puts itself back together.
Yeah.
And so, when you think about it in terms of the fire is hot, it sort of goes fire and then it splits itself into heat and not heat. And then it destroys not heat in this sort of like weird circular motion that it creates. And then goes is hot and then realizes that the hotness belongs to fire. But all along, the understanding is just sort of playing with itself, to use a sort of dirty sounding term. Like, understanding is just doing what an understanding does. It conceptualizes and it finds out the truth about what it conceptualizes. And so this whole time, like the understanding understands. And what it
Yeah.
understands is its own products. It like builds these sort of concepts out of things and then it starts to like see its self-reflection or see the thing's self-reflection in its conceptualization of the thing. And so what you might be wondering, I think, and what is difficult is a sort of progressive dropping that I think has been happening in consciousness as we've started with Hegel. So in sense certainty, we started with the this, pure being. And in sense certainty, the this, the pure being, looked like it was individual, particular, and immediate. It was not supposed to be universal and it was supposed to have no mental processes applied to it. What it was supposed to do in sense certainty was just apprehend this pure being, right? But then we started doing a whole bunch of thought experiments. We started looking at night and day and sort of those sorts of things. And then we realized that this is a universal. And so in the first week, remember, we talked about that sort of irrational, the unutterable, the singular, which when we try to say what it is, we immediately refute ourselves because language is always universal. We say this and we mean this piece of paper. But when I say this, it turns out that this piece of paper is a this like every other this. That piece of paper is also a this piece of paper. And so there's no distinction. So we can't say what this is. And then we also can't point at this. That's what the now taught us. We say now, now is not. And then by seeing that now is not, it also sort of is, or it has been, so it must have existed. And so there's sort of some transgeneric thing that's shared by all instances of nowness. And now turns out to be universal rather than particular. But Hegel drops that being. The irrational or the unutterable gets dropped behind at the end of sense certainty. We don't pick it up again. We don't talk about it again. Then the now that is universal, or the this that is universal, becomes the salt in sense certainty. It becomes a thing. And he calls this the mediated universal or the sensuous universal. So, like, salt is a sensuous universal. Very weird claim, but when you think about it, it's sort of got some sensuous character. It's got all these sensible features to it, tartness and whiteness. We see whiteness with our eyes. We sense whiteness with our eyes. And we sense tartness with our tongue. But tartness and whiteness are universal. They don't apply just to salt, they apply to other things. Whiteness applies to sugar and to a whole bunch of other things generically. And so to tartness, to berries, and so on and so forth. Then we developed that and we realized that thinghood is an also and a self-enclosing surface and contains its own difference. But thinghood falls away at the end, where being for itself and being for another can't be held apart by the insofar when thought can't hold these two distinctions apart anymore. And so we reach here what Hegel's calling the unconditioned universal, or the concept. And I think the difficulty and the real weirdness of the account is to see that through all these negations, Hegel's been removing bit by bit sort of blemishes or imperfections in our conceptualization of this thing. And sort of in, I think this is the moment of self consciousness. When we thought we were thinking about a being, all along we were thinking about a concept. And what we were thinking about is not something, but we were really thinking about thinking. And so when we realized that we were thinking about thinking, when force comes to be and we sort of see, we haven't talked about forces. I'll talk about forces a bit more in a second, but let me end on this and then we'll talk about forces. When force comes to be and we see the interplay of a force, where we see lightning, positive lightning, negative lightning, and then reconceptualize it as lightning. Or we see gravity as law in itself. We haven't talked about law. We're really doing injustice to this text, but that's okay. Where we see gravity and we see that, um, you know, the sort of, I'm losing it. Sorry, someone's calling me. When we see gravity and we see that, I can't remember the formula, that things coincide with gravitational forces. When the apple drops at 9.1 millimeters, meters per second to the negative, whatever the relational thing is, then we see how a being corresponds to a thought and sort of exemplifies that conceptualization. Hegel is not saying that we see, at least I think, how I'm taking it, and I think it's a very Kantian way to take it. Hegel's not saying that this thing outside conforms to thought. Hegel's saying that thought produces these instantiations for its own entertainment almost. Like when we're thinking and when we're trying to come up with universal laws and when we're trying to find all these particulars that fit under it, we are sort of creating thoughts to think about. We're sort of moving in and about the realm of understanding. And so when we come to see that, when we come to see that the concept is truly the unconditioned universal, and it's what we've been thinking about all along, thinking has just been thinking about thinking. And when you think about that in terms of the curtain and the appearance and the drawing back of the veil, thought thinks itself. How strange. We now have an object that is a subject and a subject that is to itself its own object.
Yeah.
What thought's really been thinking about this whole time is itself. The sort of being had to be there to get it going, but once it starts going, it's just self-thinking thought.
Yeah. The the where I'm at then is the coming to be of the concept. I want to get or the because then the difficulty I have then is then the selfhood of that concept or so it's still there's like this insistence of difference. So it's not Yeah, it's that establishment of self-consciousness via the being of the concept or the coming to be of the concept. That's the move
Maybe,
that, yeah.
I don't know if it would help for you. You are from a very Platonic sort of background. Perhaps it would be useful to go into sort of the difference between forms and concepts for you. Because for Plato, and I think for Aristotle, there's no concepts in the strictly Kantian term concepts. There's forms, and forms are forms of being. They are ways in which sort of being presents itself. Um, and so it is sort of different to a sort of Kantian conception or a sort of Hegelian conception of concepts, because that's a very modern conception. You can sort of see why. I'm not saying that like Hegel's assuming something or Kant's assuming something. I'm just saying that they've both realized that ontology, which tries to think being in itself and then just read off the characteristics of being as if though they weren't our mental concepts of being, were accurate. That's, I think,
Mm,
sort of the critique of the forms, if you want to think of it like that. It might be a bad critique, but the forms are supposed to be the rational shape that things take. The table has a form, and that form doesn't exist inside my mind, or it comes to exist inside my mind when my idea of the table corresponds to, the wherever it is. I think for Aristotle, it's in the mind of God or whatever the prime mover is. And so there's a sort of adequate conception of this idea. And so when our idea matches the thing, then we sort of have the form come to exist in our mind. Kant's not like that. And Hegel, I don't think, is like that anymore. The concept is instrumental. Like we conceptualize. And I don't mean in
mm,
the mind as in, like in my physical body in the brain. I just mean that it's instrumental in the sense that it's internal to thinking. It's not a property of, oh, it's not supposed to be a property of the thing in itself. Conceptualization is the activity of a subject. It's what the understanding does.
mm,
The understanding conceptualizes. And so what that means is that like thinking, objects don't think. The rationality of things for Kant isn't in themselves. The existence of them is in themselves, like the thing in itself exists, but it's not really, it's unclear whether it's rational. Um, the appearances are rationalized. We import our laws onto them. That's the whole critique of pure reason, is the appearances conform to spatio-temporal laws because space and times are our forms of intuition and the categories are our forms of conceptualization. And so we sort of organize this undifferentiated matter into stuff by conceptualizing it and being in this relationship to it. So I think that is really where that divide between the thing in itself and its conceptualization, or the thing in itself and concepts exist. I think what Hegel is pointing out to, and here's where it becomes very difficult to have the divide, is that the thing in itself is also for another. And so the other that is conceptualizing, the thing that thinks, whatever you want to call it, in conceptualizing is has an existence. And not only that, I think Hegel's going to disagree with Kant on the nature of concepts, because for Kant, concepts are static and they apply to everything because they're sort of maps that we can project over things. For Hegel, the concept becomes dynamic. And it becomes dynamic because what conceptualization is explained in Force in the Understanding. It's a sort of self differentiation. It's a difference which is not a difference at all. We come to conceptualize, and so we posit, I don't know, chairness. And then we try to figure out chairness, what's chairness? I don't know. And then we investigate into what chairness is. We think about the essential qualities of chairs. We don't empirically go look at chairs and, look and go, oh, chairs are wooden because that's contingent and stuff like that. But we think about the essence of chairness, and then we see, chairness is what's used to sit. I don't know.
Mm.
Chairs are sitting instruments, something like that. Something that can't be denied of chairs. But when we do that, we're just saying chairs are chairs. And so concepts for Hegel distinguish themselves. They are self differentiating, they are dynamic, and they constitute an existence for themselves, I think. Like, they have this weirdness about them that happens in Force in the Understanding where they sort of come to be over a thing, and then by thinking about themselves, by thinking about the true nature of chair, we divide this being up into sitting and non-sitting and all of these other things, and then we put it back together. But that putting back together is not just like a simple fluid motion where it returns to itself and remains what it is, but it sort of augments its being. Like now, in being more knowable, it is to a higher degree, if I can use that language. Um, and so what I'm trying to say in all these many things is that for Hegel, there can't be a distinction between sort of conceptualizing and being because, again, there can't be a distinction between being and knowing because of the many reasons we've discussed from the beginning of the text. In a sense, the concept is. And so,
Mm.
in a sense, just how Plato posits the forms, or Aristotle posits the forms, as the sort of rational structure of things, and the forms for Plato and Aristotle both have existence. For Aristotle, in the divine mind, and I think for Plato, in themselves. I'm not sure where the forms exist for Plato. So too for Hegel, concepts come to exist in a domain, if you could use that terminology. They have a somewhere that they are,
Mm.
and they are is the important point. For Kant, they remain intramental concepts. They remain subjective pieces of things that may or may not correspond to reality. They it's difficult to say whether they have a reality to them or whether it's just something that we do. For Hegel, they have an existence, and their existence is weirdly one which is self-referential, self-enclosing, allows them to be objects to themselves, and allows them to sort of investigate their own being. Concepts are sort of almost self-examining, to use that weird phrasing. Um, and they exist insofar as they examine themselves.
Mm.
Like,
Yeah.
the difficulty, I think, is that in English we use the word concept, and I think that's a very Kantian usage of the word as a noun, concept.
Mm.
A concept is an idea of a thing. That's incorrect Kantian phrasing, but it doesn't matter. What I mean by that is that if you want to draw a picture of it, some person is there's a head and then there's this little bubble and then they have the concept of chair and the concept of chair exists in the little bubble apart from the head. Like that would be
Mm.
the sort of for Hegel, the word concept almost seems to be a verb.
Mm.
Concept. Like
Yeah.
we are concepting, we are
Yeah.
conceiving, there is
Yeah.
conceptualizing happening. And so in this like separate bubble thing, there'd be a sort of conceiving thing, the concept itself, and then there'd sort of be this interplay between the concept and the conceiver. And
Mm.
that would be its reality. It would be this like constant flux that is self same in its difference. It's
Mm.
very difficult to give an image because it's like I want to say it's like a windmill. Like have you ever seen a windmill going? Like
Mm.
windmills are constantly turning, but they return to the same point as they turn. And so the conceptualizing moves around. There's a sort of motive force to it. We
Mm.
say salt is white and tart and so on and so forth. And then we return to salt,
Mm.
the end of the motion. And so by positing all these attributes, we're sort of moving around in a circle. And that moving around in a circle is the sort of self-existence of the concept. I feel like Dimple's going to hate us for being this obscure. But it's this dynamicity to concepts that is their
Mm.
sort of actuality. They sort of actualize themselves by, you know, making distinctions and positing those distinctions and then coming to realize that those distinctions fall asunder when you think about it too much.
A being distinct by like the so on that on that kind of developmental frame, like the Kant conceives, like he he births the thing in itself. He thinks it. Like the that that process of conceptualization or being conceptualizes
Mm.
the coming to be of the thing itself for itself has an implication for the conceiver of the thing itself that then, from what I'm hearing from you, is taken up with Hegel.
Say more.
In that the having not read Kant, so just receiving
Mm.
the uh, how he exists for someone who hasn't read him, the the conceiving, so conceiving the what we're saying is the concept of the thing in itself, which I am identifying this tendency of objectifying or making an object, which puts it in relationship to subject, the subject who conceives that idea. And that like that birthing, the birthing or active element of the conceiving, of coming to think that thought, even thinking its unthinkability, that that in so the shorthand that I'm getting of Kant is then the implicate, because from the way that you're presenting Hegel now, that very conceptualization does something to the subject who conceives it, because the subject is ultimately the thing conceived. So it isn't it it's a coming to be itself of the conceiver through conceiving the thing that is itself and for itself.
Yeah, I think so. I think one way of thinking about it is sort of this is going to be the more problematic way, I think. Maybe because it's going to offend people if anybody ever watches this. Um, the philosopher and the ordinary person are distinct kinds of being. Okay, what does that mean? How 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 can I assert such a thing? When you think about being, right, you're thinking about a something else, at least at first. You're thinking about the world that presents itself, and you can see this self-reflected in sort of like sciences, etc., etc. Biology thinks about plants, and we wonder about sort of normal, ordinary things, food, uh, botany, all of those sorts of things. And even at the most basic levels, before we get to biology, the child sort of plays with the plant and then asks its parents, like, what do the leaves do? And we sort of like, when we go to a garden, we see a fruit and we're like interested in whether we can eat it or not. And, all of these sorts of questions. We start to think about being, or being presents itself to be thought about. And in that sense, we are sort of ordinary people. There's nothing wrong with being ordinary. Um, but then there's the chance to further reflect on that, to notice the sort of vanishing nature of things, the sort of ephemerality to the world. and to sort of come to see that being or the thing that presents itself is not, right? The seasons change, the way that things are changes, and even though there's some sort of stuff that stays constant, everything sort of changes. And changing means not being what the thing was before. It is not. And so by watching that sort of flux, by sort of expecting something and then getting a different result, by doing those things, we come to learn, and we come to learn something about the world. We come to learn sort of its impermanence and all that sort of deep, meaningful stuff that, comes with that moment of skeptical doubt when we realize that, we can doubt everything besides the one thing that we can't doubt. When we doubt everything, we become a different kind of being. Let's call it skeptics. Skeptics exist. And not only do they exist, what their existence is typified as a sort of existence. It has a type of way that skeptics are. They are skeptics. To be a skeptic is to doubt the existence of the world. You just live your life just going, yeah, things just aren't that real, like we can doubt everything, like you're never certain of anything. And it's
Cool.
scary. You're like, the real modality of your being is affected by this way of existence. Your relationship to being has changed and your relationship to knowing has changed, and in so doing you've changed your being. I think this is sort of the very Hegelian point. From changing to the ordinary person to the skeptic, you're sort of developing. It's like how a kid turns into a teenager. There's a physical, well, to use the word physical is wrong, but there's an existential difference in being a skeptic and being an ordinary person. So as there is a difference in being a kid and a teenager, that's just a part of growing up mentally, I guess, Hegel. And then there's that moment where you realize that things are an appearance and that the world appears to be the way it is. And I think this is the third phase. And you realize that it's just how it appears. And this is sort of like what's depicted in Kant as sort of adulthood, is recognizing appearance as appearance, is going, it's all appearance, but appearance is not false, it's just appearance. It is what it is. It's coming to grips. There's a section of the Critique of Pure Reason, I think, called the Self-Discipline of Reason, or something like that, and it's in the canon of Pure Reason towards the end. And like the main point of our remember is that like reason's got to discipline itself. Like growing up means coming to the realization, or the harsh realization, that things are not like beyond and above themselves, but nor are they so illusory that nothing is real. They sort of just are appearances, and we can sort of deal with that. That's the best we've got. Like that's what we have, and that's what we work with. And so that sort of phase is sort of depicted as a sort of maturation reason for Kant. That phase where we realize that appearances are our objects, that we construct the world, that thing in itself is not thinkable, all of that sort of good stuff. But Hegel's point is, I think, this is the real thing that's going on. There's a sort of ontology of the knower. At each stage, they are something different. First important point, they are something, they exist. That something that they are is, even if it's not in itself, even if it's not necessary existence, it still is to some extent. And then to notice that at each developmental stage, the type of thing that they are is different. They are a new being at every stage. And so, where I was trying to go with this is that, like, the ordinary person is different from the philosopher. The one that knows in Hegel is a different kind of being than the one that doesn't know. Or the one that understands that the understanding thinks only itself has a different kind of life. They interact with the world differently. The world is for them different, and they are different for it. Um, and so, through that sort of differentiation, they come to be different. Like, that's what we are talking about, the power of philosophy. And that's like the what we were trying to talk about last week in that sort of philosophy PA, that philosophy has this power to change the world. But the changing of the world is also the changing of the self. And I think that's sort of almost the Hegelian point, is like self and world, even though they're distinct sides to the same thing, are in a sense self-reflecting
Mm,
objects. Like the world
mm,
reflects the self and the self reflects the world almost. Um, and so when you change one side of that relationship, you get a different relationship altogether. So
yeah.
like when we change the thing in itself, we change the subject that knows the thing in itself. And when we change the subject, we change the thing in itself. But we still always have this duality. They almost like work upon each other in this sort of like circular motion. Um, and so I think that's where self-consciousness goes. So to draw it back to the analogy of the sun and the earth and the cosmos, the sun exists by itself, the earth doesn't exist without the sun, but in this sort of sense, the thing in itself is, the earth is not the thing in itself. And by not being the thing in itself, it comes to be in relation to the thing in itself. This is not the thing in itself. And so the thing in itself turns out to be for it. It is other to an other. And once we sort of recognize that move and see that happening, so to when we look at the subject and the object was supposed to exist in itself and be the thing in itself. The subject was supposed to not be essential. The subject was just supposed to be the thinker, the other, whatnot. But in being an other, in having a sort of being, it is sort of somewhat constitutive of the thing in itself. The thing in itself is other to an other. It's not the thinker, and so now becomes a different type of object, one which is at least somewhat partially constituted by an other.
Mm. Yeah, that move, the other to the other, like the um because so conceiving the thing in itself and then following the movement and saying, okay, so the thing in and for itself is conceived by another conceiver.
Hmm.
But so it's the thing, it's the being in itself being for another. Um, you know what it feels like? It feels like, and I like that the language of blemishing, but it also feels like massaging. So there's
Hmm.
certain like places in the dialectic, I guess, that insist in terms of like maybe like an almost hollow feeling, or it's like a niggle, and then so it's like keeping returning to that part of the movement. So it's like, and then it's like, okay, but isn't there something like to um so let me um like so uh my experience of this, the there's this uh I guess to ground it in anecdote, and I'm not sure if that will be productive or not. Um, there's a uh, the title Paramahamsa. That para is like beyond, and then beyond, in and out. So a guru can have that title. There was one such who came to South Africa. I went along with people to that event. The event was
Hmm.
the whole hall lining up and each person just standing in front of this person and eye gazing, essentially,
Hmm.
looking at them. The when going to that, standing in front of this person, then there's like this little uh like a like a knot almost in my forehead, just a little, just dissolving. Which ends up having quite big implications for the way that I live my life in the next couple months. A little moment, a little loosening of a knot that in the moment of it, like small, but the knot had not been um, perceived as a knot prior to that. It was invisible. It was just
mm,
the way that my face was. And then the interaction like loosened something. So um, then when you were speaking about the coming to be of the concept. When you got there, the coming to be of the concept that came to like this whole process that we've been speaking about from sense certainty through perception into understanding is conceptualizing. But it's a conceptualizing that hasn't become conscious of itself conceptualizing. And that seems to be where we get in self-consciousness. Now I can say that, and I can have a sense of the map of the terrain, and I can also like uh, fit it with different images and different shorthands that help me kind of grip that moment. But then I still have to. It's still there will still be these insistences in me of these moments in that dialectic that it's there's something knotted. There's something not quite like a question persists for me, but like what does it mean that the thing is a self? What am I? What does it mean for me to be a thing? Well, like, I'm a concept. I'm conceptualizing. So the when you said the concept that the coming to be of the concept, which you then went into the thinking itself. The coming to be of the concept is similar like a little notch. It's like, so I'm excited to see what happens in the next few months. The then was met with that, with like a hollow, the thinking itself. So then in terms of mapping myself, like in the process, in development, the point there is thinking concept or thinking the concept, the coming to be of concept. I don't know if I want to finish that in a question. A thing that's like slightly in the terrain is a it's still this question around. So we have this mediated extremes between the inner being of the thing and the being of the I keep I keep muddling the name for this thing. The thing
mm,
the inner being of the being that wants to gaze into the inner being of the thing
mm,
and the curtain of appearance. So we get that at the end of this section, that curtain is opened. Then I can say it's now the inner being gazing into the inner being of the thing and realizing that that insistence of positing the difference between this inner being and that inner being is in some way false, or that's just understanding doing what understanding does. It's it's a that's why I think the word force is there. It's like it's it keeps positing. Still, how does where does self come in? The the thing itself, it helps it helps determine something that's in some way self-referential or self-related. So self has this returning kind of implication to just the word. It's like a self is it has that. itself puts it there in terms of itself.
One way to
So,
think about it. There's almost two ways to think about it, and I'm not sure which way is the correct way to think about it. The coming to be of the concept. The concept is had by a thing. Something conceptualizes. What conceptualizes? The self. And what does the self
yeah,
conceptualize? Itself.
itself, itselfness. It conceptualizes itselfness in a thing,
Sure,
the thing in itselfness.
sure. If you want to put it that way,
Yeah.
I think that works. Um, and so the the conceptualization, this act of conceptualization, is a sort of self-relation. It's a sort of self-consciousness. But self-consciousness is kind of weird. It's sort of a double consciousness. There's like the self that's conscious of itself, and there's the consciousness that is the self that's like the consciousness that is being aware of. But when you're really self-conscious, those two become the same thing. But it's not as if the consciousness that the self is conscious of is also the self that is conscious. They're like they both, in some sense, are and are not one.
The consciousness that the self is conscious of is not necessarily the
Self-conscious.
self-conscious. Yeah.
Yeah. So like we can have consciousness. Like we've
Yeah.
had consciousness in the past few chapters, and
Yeah.
consciousness there wasn't self-consciousness. Consciousness was of an object, right?
Mm.
To be conscious is to be conscious of an object. What consciousness is to be aware of
Yeah.
something. And the something that we took consciousness to be aware of was
Yeah.
something that's not consciousness, a thing in
Yeah.
itself, an in itselfness. But through thinking about the in itselfness of the thing in itself, we come to realize that what we were thinking about is
Mm.
consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So consciousness is, there is an object for consciousness. We think the object of consciousness is a thing in itself. The thinking that thinks that the object of consciousness is a thing in itself finds out that the object of thought was the thinking that is thinking the thing in itself.
The object of thought was the thinking that is thinking itself.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
sort of the thing in itself is it's weird. This is the two images that I'm getting. The first one I think focuses more on the subject, and the second one more on the object of the thing in itself. So the
Mm.
first one is the subject, and we start thinking about the thing in itself, and we try to think about what the thing in itself is. And
Mm.
then in our trying to think the thing in itself, the individual, the immediate, we come
Mm.
to a unconditioned universal, which is the thinking the thing in itself. The thing in itself had to be there.
Yes.
It's only
Yes.
there because the thinking is trying to think it. And the thinking is actually thinking not of the thing in itself, but always bouncing back against the mirror of consciousness to
Mm.
thought itself. It's sort of like it's like trying to get out of its cage, but every time it hits the wall, it just comes back to itself.
So, so, um, there's you, there's me, there's the thing in itself. There's thinking in itself. The part of um like a revelation in the in itselfness of the thing is that it's otherness in a way. But there's a way in that in which that otherness can be objectified.
Okay.
So that means um, its its selfhood is not my selfhood. Its selfhood is its self-referentiality. It's got this selfness about it, but it's an object to this subject. Then you're a subject. You're thinking the thing in itself.
Mhm.
I can your self consciousness or you being self in the way that I'm self seems different to the self of the thing in itself.
Yeah.
Though now just I guess just like uh playing with it, like the that you you thinking the thing in itself. What do you think about that three? The the other thinking the thing in itself, I'm thinking the thing in itself, I'm thinking the other thinking the thing in itself.
I think on the one hand it helps, but on the other it needlessly complicates things. So like the other, so you posited the other as like me and you, right? So like
Yeah,
me and you are other from one another. That's like one sense of the word other, and that's like another person. I think Hegel is also using the word other in another sense, where other just means not that thing. So
yeah,
something. So not Hadley or Daniel, but a teacup and a plate. The plate is other to the teacup. It's not a
yeah,
teacup. It's something other. And so the way in which it helps is there's this thing in itself. I'm trying. I think the trying is here important because it's unclear whether we ever actually think the thing in itself.
mm,
I'm trying to think the thing in itself. In trying to think the thing in itself, I see that it is a thing in itself. It's supposed to be
yeah,
for itself. And then in noticing that, I realize I am other to the thing in itself. I am not like the thing in itself.
yeah,
I am trying to think the thing in itself. My existence isn't like determined necessarily, all of these sorts of things. But then in trying to think the thing in itself and realizing that I am an other to it, it turns out that there is an other for the thing in itself. There is something else, me. Oh, I hope I haven't lost you at the vital moment. Okay,
gotcha, yeah,
me. Now, the thing in itself is an other to me. It is other for me. And so, in being so, the thing in itself is for an other. It turns out to have this double sidedness to it. And in a sense, I can't remember if Hegel says this, but the object sort of doubles itself. Like the thing in itself, sort of, there remains one thing in itself, and then there's also like a doubling of like the thing in itself for me. It's a double object. But so too in being a double object, and so too in me doubting the existence of myself and myself and the content of my thought, I too become a double object. And I too also have a sort of self certainty, a sort of necessary existence. I am an object unto myself and can be. And that free return ability that self consciousness avails to me is sort of, in a weird way, the same doubling as the thing in itself. The thing in itself is an object for itself, and it is an object for consciousness. It sort of exists both above and below. And so too for
mm,
consciousness,
mm.
consciousness seems to exist only below, and then we sort of like climb up the ladder of consciousness and see self-consciousness, and then it's sort of as above, so below in the realm of consciousness too.
That's
It's
where
the
my insistent not is. Like,
it's a difficult picture, but the way that I want to characterize it is the hand in the mirror. Like
yeah,
we're waving in the mirror, and we see the waving in the mirror on the other side. And what we see in self consciousness is like the what we see is the self reflection of the thing in itself.
okay, okay,
In
okay.
itself is a self reflection of consciousness.
So the uh this is great because it's helping me see the insistence of this not. Like like the the thing in itself, its otherness or the way that it others, and the implications for the subject or the one who conceives the thing in itself, or who attempts to think the thing in itself. Now, because of the nature of the thing being in itself and for itself, it conveys an otherness to the thinker of that thing. Now, you're also a thinker of the thing in itself. Your otherness seems to be different and convey a different difference than the otherness that the thing in itself conveys. I think that's the clearest I've seen the knot that has insisted for for me that uh, um I appreciate what you say in terms of it introducing something that might complicate the picture, but even my pointing there in terms of the thing in itself, like maybe the thing in itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'm
I
not
think
sure what. Uh,
I think so that was the more subjective way of doing it. That was the one that focused more on my nature rather than the nature of the thing in itself. There's sort of a double reflection going on. The thing in itself sort of has this sort of weird eject and it's sort of
okay, okay,
double
okay. Sorry, sorry,
re-objectified.
sorry. But so that's where the beginning of the knot is because because um the otherness, that being for another. So you do that dialectical move very smoothly. Like you just like boom boom.
Hmm.
And then you invert it and it's from the one side to the other.
Yeah.
But I have hesitation around the quickness of it because
You should, I think.
the 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 thing, the being for itself, is a being for itself for another. That's a revelation about the being of the thing in itself.
Hmm.
Now there's like a directionality that I don't know if it inverts in like a in a completely equal manner.
Okay. So you're trying to say there's sort of like an asymmetry between that.
Yeah, it feels like because it's the 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 other that constitutes the thing in itself, just as conceiver.
Yes. I
Yeah.
think that's where you're correct. Um, that's part of the move. And this is why we're necessarily going to disappoint in the series, because that part of the move is the move to self-consciousness. The conceiver constituting the thing in itself, or that sort of self-certainty taking center stage, is the moment of self-consciousness, right?
And an emptying, like it's an emptying into the concept, or
Yeah, it's sort of like an emptying of the thing in itself into the concept, and the concept sort of takes center stage and fills itself up with this new content. And so here's the sort of kicker: why we're necessarily going to disappoint, and why you're so hesitant about entering the realm of self-consciousness, is because self-consciousness must necessarily fall apart. Like, again, the book would end at self-consciousness if that was the ultimate unity of being and knowing,
hmm,
right? If conceptualization in this form that we've come to enforce in the understanding was the ultimate unity between being and knowing, there wouldn't be a section called reason, or there wouldn't be a section called spirit, or there wouldn't
hmm,
be a section called absolute knowing. We've seen that at
yeah,
each stage there's sort of a progress and stuff like that. And there is, that's why I like started this with such hesitance, because we've been asserting this whole time that this is going to be really the point where we see knowing and being come together in self-consciousness. But eventually, in self-consciousness, um, Hegel does say that what he's going to investigate, um, after going behind the veil, that is the curtain of appearance, is that self-consciousness falls apart. Um, self-consciousness, I think this is 177 or something like that. I'm not sure if it's the right passage to read. A self-consciousness exists for a self-consciousness. Only so is in fact self-consciousness. For only in this way does the unity of itself and its otherness become explicit for it. The I, which is the object of its concept, is in fact not object. The object of desire, however, is only independent, for it is universal, indestructible substance, the fluid self-identical essence. A self-consciousness in being an object is just as much I as object. For this, we have already before us the notion of spirit. What still lies ahead for consciousness is the experience of what spirit is, this absolute substance, which is the unity of different independent self-consciousnesses, which in their opposition enjoy perfect freedom and independence. I that is we and we that is I. It is in self-consciousness and the concept of spirit that consciousness first finds its turning point, where it leaves behind the colorful show of the sensuous here and now and the night-like void of the supersensible beyond and steps into the spiritual daylight of the present. Um, there is a sort of, here's the second way of making the move that we've been making. And I think it's the sort of way that's been being pointed to, and maybe even where your uncomfortability comes from. So the way we've been pointing to it is the thing in itself exists by itself, and then we try to think it, and then so thinking it, we find out that there's another thing, and that the thing in itself is other to that other thing. One side. The other way, and the way that relates to the sort of leftover material that left behind of the first few chapters, the irrational, the being of perception, thinghood, forces and stuff like that, is that the thing in itself ejects this material. Being births conceptualization. And
Hmm.
conceptualization has the self referential character. Like being births these sort of things, just like a mother would birth its child or something like that. Being gives birth to this sort of conceptualizing thing. And the conceptualizing thing like starts to focus on itself as conceptualizing. And then it forms a sort of organic unity with itself. Like a mother gives birth to their child, and then the child at some stage in their life grows into an independent being, an adult, and starts to look after themselves, and then like focuses only on themselves. Um, so too, conceptualization, which is sort of the adulthood of the Kantian philosophy, as I've been talking about it, or something like that, the maturation involves becoming the sort of thing that thinks about itself, like thought thinking itself, conceptualization. But there's the being that gave birth to it. And so in thinking about itself, what it's actually thinking about is the being. And that I think might be where we cannot go any further because we can't get past self consciousness, at least not in a reading group as short as this. But what I think is happening there is taking note of there's a one sidedness in the thing in itself, believing that objects are things in themselves or individual immediate beings leads us to a sort of universal sort of conceptualization. And that universal conceptualization focuses on itself for a moment. It turns to itself and goes, time to think about this conceptualization. But there's going to be a sort of return to the object, I think, a sort of independence. Um, and what that independence amounts to is I think where the interesting point is. And I think really what you want to get into. Um, I think I think this is a good point to end uh, in this sort of direction, in this sort of emptying out and sort of this failure, because I think this failure points
Hmm.
to a way to complete the failure, which is to read the rest of the book um, and to keep going. But it also points to a sort of a couple of unities between being and knowing, and a sort of knowable being that we've arrived at, which is the self consciousness. Self consciousness is a being. I am a thinker, and the thing that I'm thinking about is myself, or thinking is thinking about thinking. So it's sort of a self-thinking thought. Um, and in being so, we have an object to think about, and that object is its own content and also the thing investigating the content. Now, what I've been getting from this, and it's probably not correct to just bring in other philosophers, but for some reason, rereading Hegel this week has really made me think of Spinoza. And Spinoza is the most fascinating of the philosophers about God, I think. God is sort of this absolute substance that he posits, and then everything that is either substance or an attribute of substance. So, like, God, you can think of God as sort of a circle, and then like all the sort of attributes are sort of lines extending from God. And the two attributes that we have access to as human beings are thought and extension, or thinking, mind and body, whatever you want to call it. Anyway, so these two sort of are parallel to each other. There's sort of a being, a side of being that is spatial, that extends from God, and then there's sort of a thinking that extends from God. And so each of these can be split into tiny little like circles and moments of God's nature expressing itself. The, the sort of Spinozist move that I sort of see being made in Hegel, and what I think he's trying to do is express subject as substance. I think that's like a Hegelian slogan somewhere around. And it comes up in the preface a lot. And so, what I mean by that is that the the thinker has these sort of different attributes and sort of self-expressions, and the sort of self-expressions that they have are all a part of them. And the thing in itself also has the sort of self-expression. But the sort of point where I think Spinoza and Hegel diversify is that like these things are sort of the same and they're just like disconnected by like a mirror almost. Like the subject is a thing in itself and the thing in itself is a subject almost. Like
Mm-hmm.
there is this quintessential unity, but in positing that unity, there's a sort of disunity to the two. And so that sort of move of sort of consciousness containing an otherness, uh, the thing in itself is other to an other, it is an other for consciousness, makes the otherness inside consciousness. So, like, the thing in itself sort of invades consciousness almost. Consciousness contains a sort of otherness or not consciousness. But then, so too, not consciousness contains consciousness, or the thing in itself ejects a sort of conscious being. And so, I don't know, it's difficult to say, and to characterize it one sidedly would be to do either epistemology or ontology. To say
Yeah.
that it is the subject thinking itself,
Mm.
and to say that the world is a pure appearance or the world is the subject thinking itself makes it sound like what I'm saying is like the world is me.
Mm.
I want to say that. I want to say the world is me. But then I want to say that like I am the world
Mm.
in that very literal sense, both of those. And I don't know, maybe I'm attributing a position to Hegel that's ridiculous, but I will attribute it anyways. And if I find myself to be incorrect, I'll admit my incorrectness later. Um, the world is me says that the world is my world, that all the things that exist and that everything that is a sort of construction. That's almost very Kantian. Like the world of appearances is my world. I construct it in space and time, not the physical Hadley that's here, but whatever the thinker is that puts all these objects into places and categorizes and conceptualizes them. The world is mine. And so, in a sense, the thing in itself is for me, right? But I am the world is the thing in itself is for itself and ejects me as other. And so, as a product of the thing in itself, thinking about the world is thinking about myself, or at least the generative cause of myself. It's like a sort of self thinking. This, I don't know whether this thinking being is the thing in itself that gives birth to the thing that thinks it, um, or whether it is a non thinking being that gives birth to something that thinks it is irrelevant. But all I'm saying is that the activity of the world is to world and the activity of the thinker is to think, but both of those activities are quintessentially what I think is the same thing.
Mm.
When we've been talking about philosophy changing the world, what I mean by that is deeply and meaningfully the world becomes a different place to me, and I become a different thing in the world. That power to constitute the world through thought is a gift from the world to me. And in using that gift, I actualize its potential and change the world for myself. And so, too, I change myself for the world. Like, world and mind are in this unity. But to be in a unity, they have to be more than one thing. And so, by being more than one thing, there's also this sort of potential for disunity. And I think the niggling, you gave that example of like a teasing, the niggle, the sort of kink or the knotting. The knotting doesn't go away, I don't think.
Mm,
The knotting is all that's there in this book, I think. I think there's like easing of kinks and moving around of knots, but like the knotting has to be there. It's sort of the motor of the work, and it's
mm,
how the thought allows itself to develop. But so to just think about the consequence of the stopping of the knotting. It's the ending of thought. But if the ending of thought is being, and being is the ending of thought, then it's also the ending of being. It's
mm.
it's a non-thinking or it's a non-being. Like when we stop reading this, when we stop doing the work that is the phenomenology of spirit, we stop being the type of thinker that Hegel's describing. And so we sort of are not, if my degrees of being of persons is different. Like there's something that doing this is doing to me and changing me in a certain way. And as soon as that activity comes to an end, then like it is not in that very serious way. And
Mm.
so like I think this is the sort of uncomfortability with philosophies like these. I think it's an uncomfortability that happens in Plato as well. Like there's no closure almost, I want to say. Like there's just work to be done perpetually. And that work is the questioning of assumptions and moving through thoughts and like putting those thoughts up to the test and seeing whether they like hold together or break down.
Mm.
Um, and I think Plato, like one of the ways to think about Hegel is to think about like the personage of Socrates. Like the personage of Socrates, his very being was a person that did that. Like what
Mm.
Socrates did
Mm.
was go around and question these thoughts, and his whole existence was determined by that. Like that is what he was. Um, so too, I think in Hegel, I'm not sure because I haven't finished the book and I don't know enough about Hegel. Um, just as warnings to anybody else that I might influence unjustly. Um, I think there's this sort of rhythm in life of the whole going on, the sort of like cosmic dance happening. And once you're on the roller coaster, you sort of like can't get off. Like it's happened, you're there, you're doing it now, and it doesn't sort of go away. It's it's very strange. And I don't know what to say about it other than there's a very similar phenomenon about like living. Like we just pop into existence at some point and then like we just pop into consciousness and then we sort of like we play around as like kids and like get lost in the playground and enjoy like just like taking in the sights and sounds and like having these experiences and then like we grow and we like turn into like teenagers and we sort of become aware of ourselves and we sort of like start to like doubt ourselves and go through all these phases of like what am I supposed to be doing, what's happening, etc., etc. And this sort of just continues. Like
Mm.
adulthood's a bit easier because you're not as like critical of self, I would imagine. For some, I would imagine that's a failing, and for others, that's a virtue. But that is like what it means to sort of engage in these projects and what it means to sort of be is to sort of have a motor, sort of like a contradiction in the background. There's like a passage that like passes through by our very being every day. And so like as soon as that contradiction comes to an end, so too thought, I would imagine, comes to an end in a
Mm,
very serious way. Once like the contradiction stops in this book, it it dies, I would imagine. I would hope that the
yeah.
science of logic, because the science of logic is supposed to be the follow-on to this, that like the death isn't like a negative death, like one where something just passes away and doesn't come back into being, but in a serious sense, like once the once the contradiction is completely resolved, the sort of life of the work comes to rest. It's done.
Mm,
Something to be said about like evading that doneness or waiting to see how it completes itself that is important for this book, I think.
mm. There's a sure. Philosophy is good. Like this that in the way that Hegel insisted and this text insisted, and at opportune moments the name and the text was named such that it came to a point where it was like it's time to move through it. You just seated so Spinoza there in that manner. Um, so looking, yeah, sure. I hadn't thought that I would desire to read Spinoza, but it's been planted. The the that 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 engine of thought, that knotty insistence that is the motor of growth, or you just said it kind of plainly, but there's a novelty or there's a difference in the orientation towards that like that you do orientate yourself toward contradiction or toward that space of apparent unknowing or unease or discomfort, or um, that you attempt to bring that out, that you move in that direction. Um, that's that's the kind of thinking behind holy and the like whole in the holy cow. The reason for putting whole there. It's that disposition or orientation. Um, then since yeah, it's the final, I want to thank you for your leadership through this. It's been fantastic. For the question that you put us under, being knowable, can being be known? Um, and then there's there's a well, Sipo, Avile, myself, you all learnt under Larry. And there's a thought I was having this week is there's a way in which you have been the I think in my sense the kind of most faithful internalizer of Larry, um, of the four of us. And you are going to the States and you're studying within that that lineage. You're studying who Larry studied under. Um, it's awesome. It's really cool. So just to, I think it's a really it's an appropriate bookend to thank you and to wish you well. And there is this excitement too to see what comes from where you're going. Um, yeah, I feel complete and ex incomplete. Shall we put it there?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's an appropriate place to end.
Rad.